Hey everyone, Chris here. So just finished my Popeyes, just finished watching the Apple special event, and no surprise, the big star of the show was the announcement of the M1 Apple Silicon chip. Just to kind of recap, it was announced earlier in the year at the developer conference that Apple was going to transition away from Intel chipsets into their own proprietary Apple Silicon chips. And what they're basically doing is taking all the lessons they've learned with the iPhone and the iPad and creating the entire system on a single chip and bringing that into the Mac model line. And what that means is that now Apple is further integrating the hardware and the software between their platforms. And one of the biggest benefits this is going to provide for users is the idea of what they're calling universal apps. So now you'll be able to actually have an app that works on your iPad and iPhone that could also work on your Mac desktop. And Apple went through all the regular feature dumps of, bragging about the new improvements, 2 times here, 3 times here, 4 times here, bigger feature set, better battery life, things like that. So, but what does that actually mean for most people? Basically what you're gonna see is you're gonna see just a really decent spec bump kind of across the board, but only if you use one of 3 Mac computers, because those are, as of now, Apple has only announced 3 computers that are moving from the traditional, or the current, I should say, Intel-based chipset into the new Apple Silicon M1 chipset. So the first one is the Mac Mini. Well, it didn't really see much of an update since 2014 until a few years ago. What they did was they left the outside the same. They just painted the outside space gray, and they changed. One of the biggest things that I noticed was that the hard drive the memory was now soldered onto the motherboard, meaning if your storage went bad, you were basically screwed. You had to buy a new unit. And not only that, they also raised the price. So the Mac Mini entry level used to be like $499 or $599. They raised the entry level price on the Mac Mini to $799. Today, they've announced that the Mac Mini is now going to be migrating from the Intel chipset to the Apple M1 chipset. They're touting things that traditionally you would have to look at a iMac to get that type of performance out of it. So, for example, now with this M1 Silicon chip, the Mac Mini is going to start with an 8-core processor chipset, which is crazy because before, in 2014, the most you could do was a quad-core. So now they're doubling that from the 2014 version to this one. The thing I didn't like about what I saw about the Mac Mini this year was the Mac Mini was designed to be accessible. And so they had 4 USB ports, a Thunderbolt port, an HDMI port, all these different ways you could connect all your little various goodies to it. Well, now what they've done is on the back now, you're limited to a gigabit Ethernet port, which is great if you're a wired Ethernet user, but if you're a Wi-Fi user, it's kind of like, okay. You get 2 Thunderbolt/USB 4 ports, so it's Thunderbolt 3/USB 4. It's basically USB-C. You have 2 of those ports. Now, the cool thing with USB-C is you can daisy chain a bunch of stuff off of that. So as long as you have a USB-C to USB-A kind of like hub or adapter, you're fine. You also get 1 HDMI 2.0 slot, so that's for connecting an external monitor, which I thought was funny because in the video, they're all showing they showed all the different laptops and the Mac Mini connected to the Apple XDR display, which I'm like, okay, that's great, but you could buy 3 or 4 Mac Minis for the price of that 1 monitor. So whatever. And then you also now only have 2 USB-A 2 jacks on the back, meaning you can only connect 2 devices directly to your Mac Mini. You only have 2 USB ports on the back now, so you're limiting the number of legacy products you can connect to this new device. And then they're also eliminating the line in on the Mac Mini. So now all you have is a headphone jack. So now if you want to do any kind of line in into the Mac Mini for recording and everything, it's going to have to be going through some kind of USB interface and go in through USB-C or through USB-A. So that's the only thing I really wasn't crazy about, was the fact that I felt like they took options away from the Mac Mini line while at the same time tossing in a bunch of extra horsepower under the hood. The next computer they announced was the MacBook Air. Now, the MacBook Air was kind of like the no-brainer. I expected they were going to put the M1 chipset into the MacBook Air because it just makes sense, because in terms of portability, the MacBook Air to me is the most portable version of their computer that they have. You know, if you want anything more portable than that, now you're looking into like the iPad and the iPhone territory. So the Air has some nice updates and spec bumps and things like that, but it was kind of okay. It wasn't really anything where I was like, you know, hot damn, I need to replace my 2014 MacBook Air that I use. That thing is still rock solid. No issues, no complaints there. They still keep the same USB-C connections. The big difference though in the MacBook Air, this time now with the M1 silicon chip, is it is totally quiet. There is not a fan in that thing now because it relies on all passive cooling. So the cool part is if you want a totally quiet laptop, there you go. Now you have an option. To me, the biggest update that I saw today came in the MacBook Pro line. Now, what's important to note is the MacBook Pro currently sits into two screen size categories. You have your 13-inch and then you have your 16-inch. The M1 silicon chip is only being produced for the 13-inch MacBook Pros at this time. If you go with a 16-inch, you're going to be getting an Intel chipset, which is fine because that's what pretty much everybody else uses in terms of the developers that write software for Mac OS. So you're fine. And either way, with Mac OS Big Sur, they're introducing Rosetta, which will help, you know, power along Intel-based apps on the new Apple M1 silicon chipset. So with the 13-inch MacBook Pro, you're still getting the same 8-core base CPU chipset because that's the standard build for the M1 chipset. You're getting an 8-core GPU on it, which means you're getting, according to Apple, up to 5 times faster graphic performance on that. The biggest difference though with the MacBook Pro is the battery life compared to the previous generation. So Apple is now saying you can get up to 20 hours of battery life, which they're advertising as the longest of any Mac ever in the new 13-inch MacBook Pro, purely because of how well they've been able to integrate the Apple M1 silicon chipset and the power management of Mac OS Big Sur. So those two added together are supposed to give you 20 hours of battery life. Now, here's the thing. Most developers that I know, and that's pretty much who the Pro is designed for. It's designed for people who need who do a lot of intensive stuff. They're not leaving their MacBook off the charger for 20 hours. Now, it's great to know that. It's great to know that you can, you know, do essentially a whole day's worth of work on a single charge and be okay, because that's not been my experience with MacBook Pros. I routinely have been able to drain these suckers down pretty quick, and I'm not talking because I'm streaming Netflix or whatever like that, but you know, if you're doing something in Xcode, or if you're doing something more like graphically intensive using like Photoshop or Sketch or Illustrator, you know, or Premiere or anything like that, it's gonna drain the battery pretty quick. So I will be curious to see how this 20-hour claim holds up under like real life stress testing, because I always kind of, whenever any kind of manufacturer touts a spec, like, oh, we do XYZ% or XYZ this, I always kind of figure like, okay, you're probably pitching me best case scenario. You're not probably pitching me what reality is. So again, I will be curious to see what that looks like, what that battery spec holds up in the hands of actual developers in the real world. Now, I could be totally wrong, and that could be what the thing is, and if that's the case, fantastic. The M1 chipset, you essentially have the entirety of your system on one chip. And what I mean by that is you have your CPU, right? And so Apple did a really cool animation where they talked about how things were traditionally architected, where you have the different chipsets spread all over different parts of your logic board or your motherboard. And there's latency because they have to talk to each other across the different channels on the board. Well, by putting everything into a singular chip, Apple has very obviously reduced the space between those components, meaning they can talk to each other faster. There's no latency in talking to each other like there is when they're spread across the board. So you have your CPU, you have your GPU, you have the neural engine chipset, you have the security chipset, and then you also have your RAM. So everything is located on a singular chip, like a one big ass chip on your logic board. So what that means is, if you go with one of these M1 chipsets, if you're somebody who likes to be able to service your own components, one of the reasons I got the 27-inch iMac is because I wanted to be able to change my RAM out without paying the Apple tax on upgrading the RAM. If you get one of these M1 chipsets, you're locked in. That's what you're getting. So there's none of this, oh, I can buy it now and like tweak it or add stuff to it later on down the line. So again, this is a good thing for somebody who wants to buy something that just works and doesn't want to tinker with it. If you want to tinker with something, this is not the chipset for you. Unless you like to tinker with software, in which case, hey, this might be. But if you're somebody like me that likes to tinker with hardware on a computer, this is probably not going to be the chipset for you. So anyway, overall, really excited to see what comes out of this. They had a really cool video montage of a bunch of different developers that all kind of talked about how it was easy to make the move from Intel to the M1 Silicon. One of the big ones was Adobe, and that's kind of the one I was looking out for, which was good to see. There's other developers that have said that they've come out and said like, oh, we're not going to transition to the Apple Silicon chip. Like one of them is like Facebook is like, okay, boo-hoo. Like you have an app for the iPhone because the mobile web experience is not that great compared to your mobile app experience. But I don't know anybody who's clamoring for a Facebook app on their desktop. Like, just use Safari, use Chrome. Just that's what that's for. You know, Netflix is working on an M1 Silicon chipset, and so a compatible app. And like for companies like that, that makes sense because they want their product to be able to exist across multiple platforms, multiple devices. And so by building something, think about it, you can build it once, and then as Apple rolls this strategy out to the rest of their product lines, you can essentially build a product once that can scale instantly. So versus making a version for this, a version for this, a version for this, and a version for this. So from a product management perspective, that's actually a really smart bet on Apple to do. Like, hey, we got the mobile platform with iOS and iPad. We got the in-home platform with Apple TV and HomePod, and maybe more so HomePod than Apple, or maybe more so Apple TV than HomePod. And we have the desktop market. So you have the option to write an app once and be able to disperse it amongst a bunch of different platforms. So there may be a lot of upfront, and there is a lot of upfront heavy lifting to make a change from one chipset to another. When Apple transitioned from PowerPC to Intel, that was a Herculean effort that they were able to get done. So now I appreciate the fact that they're kind of like, they've been inching towards this. So I'm glad to see that they're doing this, and I'll be curious to see what comes out next. I have to say I was disappointed that I did not see an iMac that ran on the new Apple M1 Silicon, because I was really hoping as part of this we would also get a design refresh on the iMac. Now, I love my iMac. It's my favorite computer that I've had ever, and I used to build my own. But it is looking dated compared to the industrial design that they're doing on the newer devices. So I would have loved to have seen a new iMac with a thinner bezel around the screen, or almost like no bezel, like make it look almost like the XDR display, like almost like an Infinity Edge type thing. But I didn't get that. So, which I'm fine with because I have an iMac from 2019. It's a rock solid computer. Haven't had any issues with it. And honestly, I think my wife would kill me if I tried to tell her that I wanted to buy a new $2,000 computer when the one that I have now works fine. And I don't want to die. So there's that. So anyway, that's just kind of like some of my thoughts. I wanted to share them with you guys. Hope everyone's having a great day. Hope you guys stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you